Ignatian Migration Dialogue is JRS USA's webinar series featuring JRS leaders and guest experts discussing pressing challenges related to work with migrants and refugees. Today's focus is state and local immigration measures, how state and local laws, policies, and practices shape the daily lives and well-being of immigrants and their families. While federal immigration policy dominates national debate, decisions made at the state and local level play a critical role in determining access to services, safety, and community support. The panel will explore trends, pending bills, and how faith groups and community-based organizations help address the impacts of federal policy at the local level. In future weeks and months, we will cover topics including public safety and national security, executive orders and federal policy changes, birthright citizenship, issues facing specific communities in the U.S., and various international migration contexts. And in each case, we will dialogue with an eminent thinker, legislator, scholar, advocate, or other. Now I have the privilege of introducing Donald Kerwin, JRS USA's Vice President of Advocacy, Research, and Partnerships, who will moderate today's discussion. In addition to his work at JRS, Don has held leadership positions in several other Catholic and secular organizations focused on migration and served at both Emory University's Center for the Study of Law and Religion and Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. He has also, for the past 12 years, edited the Journal of Migration and Human Security, a public policy journal featuring scholarly articles about migration and how to create safe and secure conditions for people around the world so that they don't feel forced to migrate. After about 25 minutes of conversation, we'll take Q&A for 15 to 20 minutes or until we run out of questions. So please use the Q&A button on your Zoom interface if you'd like to submit a question. Don, over to you to introduce today's distinguished.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks to Brookwood and to Kit and NEFAC for their great work in making this session possible. Jesuit Refugee Service operates in 55 countries, working in different ways with Jesuit communities, but always with and accompanying refugees. So our mission is to accompany, serve, and advocate. And we advocate JRS USA in different forums in the United States. And states and localities represent one forum of great interest to us into the broader Jesuit world. Federal government policy in this area receives a lot of well-deserved attention, as Bridget was saying, but refugees and immigrants, like all of us, live in local communities, and the laws and policies in their communities make an immense difference in their lives. And reading back on some of these issues, I was reading, 10, 15 years back, I was very much struck by how what was happening in states and localities anticipated some of the raging federal debates we're seeing now. States like Alabama and Arizona around 2010 were trying to make life so difficult for their undocumented residents that there would be what they call deportation by attrition, which is akin to the Trump administration's self-deportation today, which is, of course, something of a misnomer because there's nothing like voluntary about it. On the other hand, you had states who were trying to welcome, integrate, and incorporate immigrants, and they argued that immigrants made their communities stronger, more prosperous, and more secure. So these debates, too, on sanctuary cities and cooperation on immigration enforcement also have long played out on the state and local level. We're going to explore today state and local bills, legislation, and advocacy. We have a relatively short time to do that, a large topic, but luckily we have three real experts with us. And they are Ann Morse, who for years tracked, categorized, advised policymakers, and taught all of us about state and local immigration legislation. So we're very fortunate to have her. She did this in her position with the National Association of State Legislators, and was just a great resource for many years. Tobin Williamson, who's been closely following and advocating state and local bills, is the senior partnership and policy manager with the Refugee Advocacy Lab. And he also reports to the Refugee Council USA members on these issues and serves as the advocacy manager for the Maine Immigrants' Rights Coalition. and Isaac Cuevas, who's a great leader in the Catholic world and is Senior Director of the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. I'm going to ask them, each of them in order, 2 or 3 questions, and we'll let them speak for 25, 30 minutes in total, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions, as Bridget indicated, and maybe for thoughts that you all have on your own work in this area. So Anne, thanks for being with us. And let me start with you and kind of ask you to lay the groundwork for us. I get what were some of, I mean, you were looking at these issues for years and years. What were some of the major themes in the immigration and refugee bills over that long period when you were tracking them?
They went from a small amount to an avalanche. It was a very interesting time to be working with state and local government. Pardon me. So I want to say my experience has been working in a bipartisan manner with state legislators and legislative staff primarily. We also collaborated with other organizations representing state and locals, like the governors, the mayors, the counties, and human services associations. National Conference of State Legislatures was where I was housed, and we were fortunate to get a grant way back in 1992 to kind of start developing this field of immigrant policy, what is happening below the federal level, which sets all the rules, the ground rules for who and how many may enter the country. We were learning that there was actually a lot of responsibility for state governments after they got here. So I also want to say, I think it's important to note at the outset that most immigrants come to the United States legally. They have come following the rules. They come to marry, they come to rejoin family, they come to fill occupational shortages to help build our economy and our businesses. I think we spend a lot of time talking about unauthorized immigration, which is important, but there's a wider gamut here, and what I would like us to do today is expand that conversation. We started in 1992 to better understand the state and local role in addressing immigration challenges and opportunities, and state legislators' role in building strong economies and safe communities for their individual states and regions. Our bipartisan task force gave us the opportunity to hear many different perspectives and identify programs that work and that they could adapt to their own states. We started reporting on state legislation in 1997. It was an easy lift then. There were only 43 bills. They focused on 4 general areas. They were public assistance, health, nutrition, and naturalization. Over time, states began addressing a wider range of issues, from education to employment to law enforcement and human trafficking, some responding to federal legislation with health insurance, for example, or the development of deferred action for childhood arrivals. So all of that, states took on growing roles, whether to look at enforcement issues where they could play a better role there, or integration issues so that people, when they came, had a better chance to get started. I'm going to stop there and let you ask me some more.
I mean, I guess I think I'd be very interested, as we all would, on hearing how you assisted policymakers in this area. And I guess, were they receptive to your advice, or was it more a case of folks that were interested in kind of making a political point? So I'd be curious as to your reflections on that.
Yeah, so what we learned over time was we did great research, credible research in short bursts that can be, as I was told when I first got on the job, it's like, somebody's going to be asking you for advice on their way to the floor, and you better be able to answer them in 2 minutes or less. And so all of the work that I did was taking stacks and stacks of research and turning all of those volumes into one piece of paper and being able to say, these 3 points are the most important for you to consider as you go onto the floor. We benefited from having a task force on immigration in the states, which involved equally bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, coming to the table with the issues that mattered most of their states. And we did a series of briefings within our meetings and then going to site visits so they could see for themselves what the clients were doing, what the organizations that serve them, like yours, are doing to help make a success out of this big leap for a new arrival to the United States. They did a range of of interesting things, like where do immigrants fit missing niches in our employment? One of the things that really grew is occupational licensing. We have health shortages, health worker shortages, and lots of states figured out, how do we turn their foreign experience into something that's workable in the US environment? How do we deal with accreditation? How do we get them through this process faster so we have healthier communities? It's not a big lift to say this works and will make us better. The other piece that I wanted to remember to say is that with refugee resettlement, for example, these are people who come with some skepticism about the value and safety of working with law enforcement. So policies that make them afraid to engage with law enforcement means victims won't be reporting their crimes and witnesses of crimes won't be caught talking to the police. So I think the overall suggestion I have for working with state and locals is balancing priorities. It's not just one end, take people out of the country. It's how do you address people who are trying to do the right thing, they're trying to work, they're trying to get their kids to school. What makes it better and what is the value add of that? We have smarter kids, we have better results down the line. So people can create businesses as well as be filling worker shortages. So pros and cons, that's all I'm asking. Work through the costs and the benefits.
And that's a best practice in itself, huh?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Tobin, I know you're closely following these issues, and I greatly appreciate when you present on them because you're so well informed. But I guess the first question might be like, how have these trends or these battle lines, if you will, on kind of a state and local level, how have they changed over the last few years, or even from the time when Anne was tracking them?
Sure. Thank you, Don. Yeah, similar to what Anne said, in even just the past few years, interest in state level legislation and local policies around immigrants and refugees has really exploded. Back in 2020, the Refugee Advocacy Lab had identified around 50 bills that were either pro-refugee or anti-refugee across the country. And that number last year was closer to 300. And so that really just showcases how interest in these topics has trickled down to state legislators, folks working at the state level and things like that. And it's not just there's been an onslaught of pro-refugee and immigrant bills or anti-refugee or immigrant bills. It's been both. More and more advocates and champions for immigrants are introducing more inclusive policies. More critics or those who oppose immigration are introducing more and more restrictive policies, and you're seeing it just kind of increase on for both perspectives. So yeah, that's one significant change that we've definitely noticed in the past few years that the lab has been involved with tracking legislation around the states.
And from your perspective, have you had some good successes kind of on a state and local level? Did you want to talk about them?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So in terms of some successes, a lot of the bills that I was referencing before, the pro or the anti, it's going to be tough to pass legislation that would, unmask ICE agents in certain states, or legislation that might increase in-state tuition for asylum seekers in other states, things like that. But there are occasionally examples of success that we're able to find. You see champions on both sides of the aisle, bipartisan success. And so that's where the lab, my organization, really tries to lean in and see what might, folks be able to compromise about, what might get accomplished if folks work together. And so some specific examples of that, Anne mentioned occupational licensure issues. We've seen a big trend in the past few years around licensure reforms for internationally trained physicians. and even in some unlikely places. In my home state of Arkansas, I believe there was one last year. We've seen ITP bills pass in places like Indiana, North Carolina, as well as some more purplish moderate states like Minnesota or places like that. I believe there are over 20 states across the country now that have passed some sort of physician licensure reform for internationally trained physicians. And groups like WES, World Education Services, are really leading the charge on that. And we've also seen more and more interest in other professions as well, teachers, nurses, places like that that have, like Ann said, tremendous labor shortages in a lot of places. So that's one wide example of success. Another is what's called the State Offices of New Americans Network. This is run by WES and the American Immigration Council. Similarly, there are over 20 states that are now part of the ONA state network, which are agencies within state government that work to increase, workforce development skills, integration, things like that for new Americans. And then a couple of other successes we've seen involve things like language access or anti-discrimination, preventing landlords from discriminating based on immigration status, things like that. So even though the climate right now is really polarized, and sometimes it seems increasingly so, there are still occasionally a few wins to celebrate.
And are you concerned about particular bills or groups of bills coming down the pike? I mean, are there a couple of those that you'd like to speak about?
Yeah, of course, on the flip side, it's a very tense time across the country right now. A couple of wider issues that we've been keeping an eye on, that we've seen introduced in several states, kind of like a trend. I know there's a handful of states that are trying to find legislative challenges to something called Plyler versus Doe, which is a court ruling from 1982 that basically says students have to be educated in public schools regardless of their immigration status. And there's a few states, I believe Tennessee, Oklahoma, maybe a couple of others, that are trying to get this challenged. And so they're introducing legislation that would basically prohibit students without the right documentation from attending public schools. So that's one that we've been keeping close watch on. Increasingly, there's been the more state level attention on the refugee resettlement program. Dating back almost 50 years now, this has historically been something that has seen bipartisan support. President Reagan, President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden, they've all generally seen the value of the U.S. being a country that welcomes refugees. And, starting around 10 years ago or so and accelerating in recent years, this has become a partisan issue. And that's started to flow down to the state level as well. So just this year, we've seen state level attacks on U.S. refugee resettlement in New Hampshire. There's a bill that has a hearing just next week. We're monitoring some legislation in Wisconsin that would require local consent to resettle refugees, which brings back an issue that we saw a couple of years ago in places like Eau Claire. And then I guess the last thing, the last big issue to talk about is the impacts of the One Big Beautiful bill from last year, and its impact on food and healthcare security for refugees and other immigrant populations, and how states respond to that, making sure that folks can get the food and the health care that they need to thrive. So, and then probably the greatest threat of all, I would say, again, just kind of echoing what Ann said, is just this continued partisan division and increasing polarization across the country. And so, hopefully we will be able to celebrate more wins as the years go by, and the tone will shift a little bit moving forward, but to be determined.
I mean, it seems to me like that's a major theme of everybody that works in this field at this point. And I looking at it historically, it does seem like there's been progress in certain states, over time, which is interesting. So you're not talking about kind of monolithic places where advocacy doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference, kind of the hard work that you all do. And also, like looking at bills in particular states, you see that there's a lot of diversity, both pro-immigrant things can be done, and things that would make life more difficult for immigrants are pending too. So it's a pretty complicated field.
Yeah, just thinking of one specific example, this legislative session in Ohio, some of the legislative Democrats held a press conference, introduced legislation that would protect immigrant communities, promote inclusive policies, things like that. And then shortly after that, their counterparts on the other side of the aisle also held a press conference, supporting something called the cooperation package that would basically put Ohio at the national vanguard of working with federal immigration enforcement. So yeah, that just kind of speaks to how as the nation's politics become ever more polarized and nationalized, you see more and more of folks seeing it as like a competition rather than a chance to collaborate.
And the bills seem to come ready-made. It's not like they're organically arising in communities, are they? They
That's
come from, yeah.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of bills this session, whether it's pro-immigration bills like the unmasking ICE legislation or sensitive locations legislation, or some of the more restrictive ones that would enforce what's called 287G agreements that require state and local law enforcement authorities to cooperate with ICE. They're all introduced state by state by state by state. And sometimes, the template language is the exact same, whether it's in one state or another state. So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's turn to Isaac, who's really been a leading voice in the Catholic world on work with immigrants and has worked extensively with immigrant communities for more years than I think either of us would like to admit, because I've known him for a lot of those years. And I wonder, Isaac, if you can run through some of the recent advocacy related to enforcement in particular, but also support of immigrants that you're seeing and maybe following in Los Angeles. Can't hear you. I think you're mute. There you go.
You would think we would figure this out after so many Zoom meetings and COVID. Thank you, Don, Tobin, and Anne for all you guys do. It's really an honor just to be here and to share with you guys. Don, to answer your question, the advocacy for us is really more rooted in accompaniment, especially as it pertains to everything that's happening with the enforcement. It's been really, really heavy, and something that both Tobin and Anne mentioned in their talks is just how that partisanship, that divide that's happening is now carrying over, and we can feel that weight really present with so many people in our community. That advocacy really looks like work and taking action and being present where people need us. We've been able to shift from a know your rights style of presentations to more of a know your risk presentations, and that's very intentional in that we know that a lot of the rights that people used to exercise before June 6th, and I mentioned June 6th because that was kind of like the epicenter of all of this enforcement that took place here in Los Angeles. Before that date, it was clear that you could exercise those rights. Those rights have really been stripped away in many forms and in many fashions, and not just for people who are undocumented, but just simply for people who look like they could be undocumented. And that's been a challenge. Part of our work has been in showcasing how to potentially what happens if ICE shows up at one of our schools or parishes? These are questions that have come up from our facilities, our locations, and we've had to create a set of guidelines on best practices, what to do, what does that look like, the difference between enforcement and removal operations under ICE. These are the officers that are kind of out on the street that you see they're doing all this enforcement, and Homeland Security investigations, which are really more like the detective version of ICE, and they actually are out there going after criminals and looking for human trafficking victims and people who commit those crimes, digital trafficking, all of these things that really have more of a criminal element to it, and what is our responsibility. We've also created really proud that we've created a network of clergy, deacons, and women religious that are doing court accompaniment. People don't feel like it's a safe thing to do right now to go to court when you're undocumented, and for the undocumented community and even people who have some kind of legal status and process in place, they misunderstand going to court with a simple appointment or some kind of process, some kind of procedural situation. We just had an incident where a gentleman who has DACA is being asked for the first time to show up and at one of the facilities and do fingerprinting. And he doesn't want to go by himself. So we partnered him up with a clergy member that's going to join him. The chances are very low that something is going to happen. He doesn't have any criminal record. There's nothing in his past, but that fear and that apprehension is very much present. We're also working really closely with trusted partners like Catholic Charities, Cheerluck Edison, local organizations. There's just not enough of us to do a lot of this work out there in the public purview. So everything that we can do to just kind of expand that network and get people informed and aware is essential. And then last but not least, I mean, the biggest component of the advocacy moment is us being able to take the stories that we feel and hear and see as those kind of spiritual first responders in our parishes and take them to our civic leaders and make sure that these stories are being heard, that they're amplified, that people know what's going on and the injustice in many instances and what we can do about it.
I guess it's a great advantage for the Archdiocese to have somebody like Archbishop Gomez there, and such a great leader on these issues. But like, maybe you could talk a bit about, I know he's been speaking out, but kind of what he's been saying, what he's been doing, kind of how he's been trying to lead in this difficult time.
Yeah, I think for Archbishop Gomez, I think it's providential that he's here and that he's the spiritual leader of our city. And years ago, I think it's going on 10 years now, he wrote a book called The Next America, where he really spoke to that immigrant journey and the need to have a pastoral lens before we talk about immigration in terms of politics. He's said it very clear. Immigration is not an issue of politics, but it's about people. It's a topic that needs to be understood from a human dignity standpoint and recognizing that the laws in our country are broken. It's the one thing that both sides of the aisle agree on, and it's just unfair that we haven't been able to move forward with some kind of reform. Archbishop has often points back to the fact that yes, a country has the right to secure borders and to have laws in place around immigration, but those laws they need to be fair. They need to be just. Behind every policy that somebody in Washington puts forward, there's an individual, there's a real life person who's impacted by those policies. Also, he's been steadfast in his just pastoral leadership and making sure that people understand that as a community of faith, we recognize that the fear is real, but we have to also just be compassionate, be understanding, and be present with those who are experiencing that fear. Especially right now that we're going into this season of Lent, it's taking into consideration that prayer is important, prayer is essential, and but also action. What more can we be doing as people, and how can we be there and be present with those who are experiencing these kind of issues?
Your comments on accompaniment as advocacy are very powerful to me. I know too, though, that the Archdiocese is really mobilized in terms of trying to meet the material needs of families and communities, as a result of mass deportation and all the fear in the community. I wonder if you'd talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think once Archbishop, again, he's been very vocal, he's been very present about the injustice, and immediately took action in creating a fund, thanks to some very generous benefactors that were able to create a fund that helps parishes provide stability and resources for people who are experiencing crisis. Our parishes have become places of trust and stability. People feel like they can't go out in the streets, they can't work, and more often we're getting requests for food pantries, but not food pantries in the traditional sense where people would come to the parish. But now people are saying they're too afraid to even leave their homes, so the parishes are organizing and mobilizing and getting those that food and creating delivery processes for people to make sure that they don't have to come out and they don't have to put themselves at risk. We're also seeing a big need for just mental health, and not just for the communities that are impacted by this, but I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention how more and more we're seeing conversations spring up about people who may have voted for this administration and now are having some form of buyer's remorse, and they don't know how to engage in that conversation, and they're turning to their leaders, their spiritual leaders, their priests, clergy, and asking, what more can I do now? This isn't what I was expecting when I put forward my vote. So a lot of this is really weighing on people, and we're noticing that it's the time to utilize our faith and to express that need for action and support and compassion for one another.
Do you just kind of just a final quick question? I think I know the answer to this, but are you seeing kind of a diminished participation in mass and sacraments and kids attending school and coming to food banks and the like as a result of some of what's going on?
Yeah,
In
very
other words,
much.
is it interfering with your practice and the practice of the faith, I guess, is really the question.
There's a very pronounced impact all around, in the city, in our churches. You can feel the tension, and yes, they're not coming out, they're not going to catechism, they're not coming to mass. And I want to be clear, we also haven't had any enforcement at any of our parishes, schools, or hospitals, right? These locations haven't been targets per se for enforcement, but there has been enforcement that happened in the areas around these locations. So it's created an impact. People feel it. People know it, and it's diminished the turnout for many of our locations, especially those in cities and in areas that have been most affected by the enforcement.
Thank you. I think we're going to turn quickly to questions from the audience, but maybe just one or two questions for all of you, and you don't have to answer both of them or either of them if you don't want. But I think you already have kind of answered the first question, which is that, with everything that's going on federally, why work on state and local issues? I mean, if you'd want to just speak to that, I think it would be helpful. And then where are you seeing the greatest need for engagement? Is it accompaniment, service, advocacy, some combination of the two, or whatever. The real question is, what can people do now? What should they be doing now? People that care about these issues.
I have a thought, if I can go. Counterintuitively, what I would say is educating state and local legislators and elected officials about the need for federal reform. The reason we're having so many issues is because we haven't updated our laws since 1986. Immigration Reform and Control Act, which addressed both legal and unauthorized immigration in the same bill, has not been brought up to speed. So that's what, 26 plus 14, do the math for me. We've had entire industries grow and collapse since we've updated our immigration laws. And so for our own better interests, let's focus on common sense immigration reform issues. And then we'll have to do less work at the state and local level because the work will have been done at a national level. Aside from that, what I would say is focus on where the value is, that people are not takers, they are growing our economy. The vast majority of economic studies show that. So that's where I'd say is focus on the broader reach, the broader impacts. Thanks.
Yeah, I would underscore Anne's comments in from a ministry standpoint, is not being afraid to just go out there and have these conversations, have some listening sessions, and really inviting participants from all over to be a part of this. More and more often, I'm realizing that traditional media is no longer creating much of an impact in people's lives right now. You have to actively go out and consume your news. And when we do consume the news, many times we consume the news that we are already feeding into and we're already hearing, right? So you're only getting a very narrow perspective of what could potentially be going on. So bringing a lot of people in under our parishes and in these safe places creates an opportunity to really kind of share and give people more perspective on the impact that this is having, and get to the core of what's true and what's not true. I keep hearing, they're going after the criminals and the people who don't belong here, and it's just not true. They're going after citizens. They're going after people who have some form of status or even pending immigration cases, and they're doing everything they possibly can to fast track detention and deportation. And that's not who we are as a country. There should be protocols in place to stop these things.
Thank you.
I think from my perspective, part of the importance or the need for state and local advocacy is just because there is such inaction or deadlock at the congressional level, at the federal level. We've all talked on this call about how at the state level it's possible to see some movement, whether that's good or bad depending on your perspective, what sorts of bills get through. But the fact that bills are getting through is better than can be said oftentimes of what's happening on Capitol Hill in DC. Studies have shown that it's every year, it seems, it's the least productive in Congress in history in terms of the number of bills passed. And, each new year breaks that previous record. And so I think the chance to really engage and make a difference in your community is why state and local advocacy is so important. And then kind of related to that, if you want to try to meet with your member of Congress, if you do it like a fly-in to DC day or catch them at a meet and greet or something like that, at most you might get 5 to 10 minutes, probably with a staff member, not with the member themselves. And you might never have a chance to have a conversation with the lawmaker in general. But if you're trying to reach out to a state legislator or a city councilor, the chances are they might just say, like, let's meet for coffee, or come to my event, or let me come to your event, something like that. And so the chances for engagement with state and local policymakers is much, much greater than at the federal level. And I think so much of effective advocacy is all about like sharing your story, telling why this issue matters to you or that issue matters to you, why you care about why you're talking about. And I think you have a much greater chance of doing that at the state and local level than you would at the federal level.
Those are all great points. Yeah, thank you. Bridget, I know that you've probably got some questions for us from the group.
We have some very good questions. So I will more or less take them in the order they came in. An attendee asks, you talked about, quote, ready-made immigration legislation proposals. The question is, who ready makes them?
Tobin, I don't know if you want to talk about that. I'm happy. Why don't you, if you'd like to, or I could. But... Tobin, did you want to address that?
Yeah, I was just going to say a lot of it depends. I don't think there's really any one sort of central organization that does these they're called model bills. I think a lot of it is like national level lobbying or interest groups that care about a certain issue, whether that's education or healthcare or legal defense or whatever the case may be. They cultivate relationships with state legislators, with legislative staff, and then in advance of the upcoming sessions, they kind of set up meetings or send out on their listserv or whatever the case may be, this drafted legislation, and they're like, why don't you introduce this in your state, and we can cater it as needed, things like that. But it really depends on what the issue is and who the legislators are. So perhaps one of my panelists or my fellow panelists or Don or something like that might have more clarity on that. But yeah, it really just depends.
I mean, I think it's the nuts and bolts of DC lobbyists that have been doing this for a long time, sometimes in a very organized way, so that the result of that is that you see the same bill like appear magically line for line, in 12 states in a particular year or whatever the case might be, despite the fact that the realities and conditions in those states is very different. So it's not a very democratic thing at the very, to say the least. And it'd probably be, states would probably be better off considering their needs, their communities, their values and the like, and kind of developing and thinking about these things organically, but often that doesn't happen.
Did anyone else want to weigh on this question, or shall we move on? We'll move on. Mary Quigley in Fort Wayne asks, are you tracking bills like Indiana's SB 76, which seeks to increase the cooperation of local and state police with immigration efforts, such as using detainers? Is there bipartisan data to show how these bills influence overall safety in communities and how they influence community trust in police? Also, how they fit into other issues regarding jails, restorative justice, etc. Tobin, I saw you nodding your head. Yes.
So just nodding yes in that. Definitely SB 76 in Indiana is something that we have been tracking with my organization. We do have a legislative tracker that sends us updates about when things like public hearings are, committee votes, or things like that. And we have noticed that we're not working on advocacy around that directly. There are a lot of wonderful organizations in the Hoosier State that are on the ground and do have, really close connections within the state and are activating their communities. And so, we kind of just leave the advocacy up to them. But we are closely following to see how it progresses through the legislative process. And that's one of the similar bills that I mentioned. We're seeing very, very similar bills introduced in states throughout the country that would require state and local police departments and other law enforcement agencies cooperate with federal immigration authorities.
The tracker, is that publicly available to people, or how do you disseminate that?
Yes, we have a public link for that, and I can share that out afterwards. Yeah.
So it's a great tool.
Yeah, that's outstanding. From Oren Root, we have the question, what are the most effective ways to get state Catholic conferences to lobby their state legislatures for pro-migrant legislation?
I mean, I think I may be the expert in this, but I'm not, well, actually, I'm not. Isaac is probably the right person to answer this question, but I do know that the state, why don't you go ahead, Isaac, but I can talk a little bit about what happens in DC then.
I think that the best way to go about this is speaking with the bishops, setting, and being cordial, right? Calling up an office, setting an actual appointment, coming in and having some ideas and some thoughts laid out on, what legislation would matter. The bishops get together and they review everything that's being proposed at the state level, and they have to rank and prioritize what do they want to support, and also what's impacting the church or the faithful in a manner that's direct, where the bishops feel like they can have a say so in this, rooted in Catholic social teaching, rooted in the gospel. So I think the best way is to have that conversation, have that dialogue, maybe working with some organizing groups locally and formulating those voices so that bishops have the ammunition that they can take to their brother bishops and then have a collective voice around one of these issues.
I'd say too that it's the case, and it has been for a long time, that the heads of the state Catholic conferences are linked into the U.S. bishops. I know that they'll come every year and meet with the bishops' conference staff, so that there's some real cross-fertilization there in terms of what people, what they're seeing locally, what the important issues are, and how they might be addressed on a federal level or a state and local level.
All right. We have a question here from Gregory McKinney, who says, isn't Minneapolis an example of what can be done with a local focus in place? Lots of grassroots, but that lead local and state officials to speak out, in fact, required to. Any comments on that?
It's happened in Minnesota, the success of it, because it's had, if you want to put it that way, there's been a lot of trauma and loss of life there too, but the advocacy has been extremely strong. And I don't know, Tobin or Ann or Isaac, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think there's been a cause and effect situation that's happened in Minnesota, and I think because of it, right? And historically speaking, what happened with George Floyd and the fact that communities organized around these kind of things, I think there's a sentiment of built up frustration, and it's created a need for a response to all of these things, and it's simple, straightforward. The more you push and bully a kid, at some point that kid's gonna grow up or get tired of that bullying and want to swing back.
I'll chime in, and I'm a bit biased because my brother-in-law lives in Minneapolis, and so I've been following what's happening there very closely. But just from an outsider's perspective, I have been extremely impressed by the elected officials in the state of Minnesota in the past few months. If for nothing else, just speaking out in support of their immigrant and refugee community members. Over the past 12 plus months, that's something that we honestly have not seen much of throughout the country. Folks have been a bit muted, a bit understated. But right from the jump, the folks in Minneapolis, whether it's the mayor, city council members, state legislators, they're showing up at immigrant-owned businesses and encouraging the community to come out and spend money and shop there. You see Republican state legislators in Minnesota talking about the value that Somali Americans bring to his community, and inviting members of the administration to come see for themselves how refugees enrich Minnesota. And it's just been really inspiring, I think, after a tough several months of just general, I don't necessarily want to say fear, but trepidation, I guess, to speak out on behalf of those community members. And it's unfortunate that this is kind of what has led to that. But I think they have responded in a very admirable way with the way that the officials are representing the community members that they serve.
And we have one final question that I'm actually going to take a slight privilege with to try to turn it a little bit more towards state and local, sort of legislative action. The question is from Catherine, and the crux of it is, I'm curious how we can support immigrant health without putting them in a risky spot. Is there something really beyond, health and wellness fairs, things that are being done at parishes, things that are being done by community groups that might support, very real healthcare needs right now? I mean, I'm sure a lot of you, as I did, saw reports of pregnant women not seeking prenatal care, or even, in fact, care at delivery because they were hearing rumors of ICE roaming hallways. So I think this is certainly a very real concern.
I have one story I tell a lot in my years of working with legislators. They tend to be practical. How many stakeholders are involved? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And this particular Southern Republican legislators had a wife who was a pediatric nurse. And she said, for every $1 you spend in preventive care, you save $9 in emergency and chronic care. Something simple, short, effective.
And in terms of what people can do, for folks that are scared to go out, like obviously, the person in the situation that you mentioned, this wouldn't be applicable to, but I know in my community, I live in Southern Maine, and we've also seen increased immigration enforcement in recent months. And one big thing is community members are volunteering to take groceries or other supplies to folks that might have some sort of reluctance to be out on the roads or out in the streets. Just finding, communal meals or something like that. So just finding ways that you can plug in and be supportive of folks, I think is so important right now. And that sort of sense of community and togetherness can really go a long way.
Yeah, I'll also chime in with, here in Los Angeles, our office, the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace, also accounts with a person dedicated to being the interface with our chaplains, our healthcare workers that are out and present and training and being with them, continuing to have them grow in their faith and in their formation, but within that vocation that they've chosen to serve people in the healthcare space. And you don't often find that trusted individual who also has the spiritual direction of knowing and understanding the needs of people in critical situations. So being able to share with those individuals and having that built-in network there helps give us another person that can advocate on behalf of these communities, and bringing them in, ensuring that they have the healthcare that they need, or at least doing outreach and having a trusted individual within. I think a lot of what's happening right now needs to be relationship driven, and a lot of that you'll find in your parishes. It needs to be fostered.
Hey, maybe we'll just ask kind of one final question, because I think we're at the end almost, but it would be great if there were some more bipartisanship on some of these issues. I think we could all agree on that. And there is a little bit in terms of the pushback on the abuses and excesses of the mass deportation. I mean, you are starting to see that a bit. And I'm wondering if there's other examples of it. I mean, are you hopeful that people that have been polarized are coming together now, or is it as bad as it's ever been?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, it's been somewhat encouraging to see public opinion shift a little bit. There's been recent new polls or studies that show that the public opinion on the mass deportation efforts are shifting a little bit, because I think it's one thing for folks to have this sort of idea of the federal agents going after criminals or people that quote unquote deserve to be deported, things like that. But it's another thing when you see them going after your kid's friend's parents, or your local restaurant, or your local hairstylist or something like that. And so I think as more and more people start to see these sorts of personal impacts in their communities, not this this concept of what mass deportation looks like, but what it actually looks like, I think people are starting to shift a little bit in what they feel. I mean, Isaac referenced it earlier. Folks that maybe voted one way are starting to second guess or things like that. So I think again, it just comes down to community and the importance of connecting with the folks that and seeing what sort of impacts that policies have on them, and really shape hearts and minds and change attitudes.
One thought on that is that advocates do a lot of work preparing legislators for what's going on in the community and policy solutions they'd like to see. What I rarely hear is, after the fact, thanks for doing the work, and here's what it resulted in. This is how important your work was, and this is how the community is benefiting. So circling back for that, reinforcing us, and the next time we come with a problem, we know you'll solve it.
It's great advice. Thank you.
I mean, I think I would wrap it up with just saying, the importance of having well-formed people in our pews. There's a lot of people that are out there that call themselves Catholics, yet when it comes down to talking about topics like immigration and the common good and ensuring that human dignity is put forward before politics, some of these same people will look at you like you're speaking another language, funny enough. So I think, unless we have really well-formed individuals in our pews, it's hard to find that common ground in the areas where you can have fair and adequate laws, but that are also balanced out with mercy and compassion, and more than anything, that will push for change and reform in our country, something that we need.
Well, look, thank you, all three of you, for your expertise and your compassion and the work that you've been doing for lots of years now. We really appreciate it, and thank you for being with us today. And we hope to kind of stay in touch, and maybe next year when we do this, the news will be better, or that we'll be farther down the road. But we really appreciate your time and your work over so many years.
It was a pleasure, Don. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.